So hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Danielle Daw. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Halton Hills Public Library, and I will be your host for this evening's event. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Halton Hills Public Library is located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit on Treaty 19. Just also a few housekeeping items before we get started tonight. So we will at the end of the event be doing a Q&A, and that will be taking place through the chat box. So on Zoom, you can locate the chat in the bottom menu if you're on a computer. If you're on your phone, it is hiding under more options. So you can jot down your questions and submit them through the chat towards the end of the event. Oh, and we also ask if you are submitting a question that you send it to everyone so that we can all see it on the call rather than to a specific individual. Tonight's event is part of our Exploring Indigenous Roots program series. And so I would like to thank the Government of Canada for their support of that program. Please also note that we are recording tonight's presentation and it will be available on our YouTube channel later this month. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. So Harold R. Johnson has lived a remarkable and varied life. He has served in the military. He has worked as a miner, a trapper, and a fisher, amongst some other roles. And he also obtained a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Saskatchewan before going on to graduate from Harvard Law School and working in private practice. Presently, he is living on his family trapline in Western Canada. Now, as an author, Harold R. Johnson has released numerous works of both fiction and nonfiction. His book, Firewater, How Alcohol is Killing My People, was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction in 2016. So this year, he has returned with the Bjorkan Sagas. Now, this recently released novel draws on his Cree and Scandinavian roots and has created this narrative fusion that is combining myth, history, and fantasy. So that book is now available both at the library and from your favorite book retailers. So with further ado, I am going to hand it over to Harold, who's going to talk to us tonight about storytelling. So over to you, Harold.
Yeah, I just want to make a correction you might not have been aware of. We have left the trap line and I'm now living on Gabriel Island, British Columbia. We came out here to do an interview with Sheila Rogers, CBC Radio, The Next Chapter. And my wife grew up in Vancouver. And we got here and we're parked in Sheila's driveway early in the morning. Joan got up, made her morning cup of tea and went down on the shore just to sit by the ocean and have her morning tea. She came back a half hour later, she was crying. Not because anything was wrong, it's because it was so beautiful. The ocean and the rocks and the mountains and the trees and it being her own territory. And I realized this woman lived with me for 20 years in a cabin in northern Saskatchewan. Off-grid, no road, no running water. And I realized that it was time I lived in her territory. So last October, we bought a house on Gabriola and we've been here within a couple of days of being a year. We moved here October 15th. This is my new space to write. When I lived in a cabin in northern Saskatchewan, I worked out of the loft and
I think we lost you there for a second, Harold. There we go. Yeah, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my link went down for a second. My screen went blank. Lost where I was. Oh, I was looking off into the distance. I find it helps to have a window and to be able to look outside. Here on Gabriola, I don't have the ability to look off into the distance, but I have these huge windows beside me that look out into a beautiful garden. And when I get stuck writing, that's the new place that I look, is into the flowers and the trees. There's two beautiful cherry trees out there, a walnut tree, there's figs. They're still just about ready to pick now. So that's where I'm looking. And what you look at influences what you write. It all comes back around. I'm talking about story and how powerful they are. Start by telling you my story. I was born into a community of trappers and fishers. There's about 250 people living in a community called Malanosa. And growing up with trappers and fishers, I heard the stories of trapping and fishing and believed I could be a trapper and a fisherman. My father died when I was 8 years old. My mother took over trapping and fishing. And I was about 13. I was walking the trap line behind my mother. It was March. It was a beautiful day. Sun was shining. It was to the southwest, so maybe about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a warm wind blowing from the same direction. I remember everything about the day. Beautiful blue sky with a few wispy white clouds. Warm wind coming from that same southwest direction. The sound of my mother's moccasins on the snow. It had melted and frozen and melted and frozen and had a different sound. And she stopped and said, "My boy, you have to learn this. You have to learn how to trap. You have to learn how to fish. You have to learn how to make your living off the land in case anything ever happens to that other world." She lived through the 1930s. She knew about things happening to that other world. And we don't always listen to our parents, but for some reason that stuck. And I made sure I could live in both worlds. I'm not the best bushman. There are people with more wood skills than I have, but I can survive. And that's made all of the difference. When I worked at a mining camp and the foreman was giving me grief, I could tell him to piss off. Go ahead and fire me. Doesn't matter. I'm going to survive. And I was telling my wife that that ability gave me all of the confidence to do everything that I did, including going to Harvard. And as soon as I said it, I remembered the first things I packed into my car before driving to Cambridge was my camping gear and my tent. If I had those along, I was going to be safe. When I was 17, a man from my community came back from Cyprus and Egypt. He'd been a peacekeeper, and he told me stories of peacekeeping. And I heard those stories and believed them. And at 17, I joined the Canadian Navy, Maritime Command, as a Marine engineer, and heard all of the stories and songs of maritime tradition. And I took them into myself, and I told myself, I'm a hard-working, hard-drinking sailor man. When I got out of the Navy, I went back to northern Saskatchewan. And my older brothers had been loggers and miners. And I heard their stories of logging and mining. So for the next several years, that's what I did across northern and western Canada. Everything I owned fit in a pack sack. My home was a bunkhouse. And I told myself, I'm a hard-working, hard-drinking, tough son of a bitch, miner, sailor, logger, don't fuck with me. And I wasn't putting anything on. That's who I believed I was. I met a woman, got married, had children. My story changed. I became the hardworking provider protector. And if I'd have dropped the hard ass part of my story, my marriage might have survived. It didn't. 1991, I was working at the Key Lake uranium mine as a heavy equipment operator. And there's a story going around that said if you drive a cat or a haul truck, you're stupid. Well, I'm not stupid. And to prove I'm not stupid, I quit mining and I went to university. Picked the hardest thing they had. I picked law, not because I wanted to be a lawyer. I was just proving a point. Harold Johnson isn't stupid. If you get a degree in anything and you're Aboriginal, there's a story that says, you didn't earn that. They just gave it to you because you're an Indian. So to prove nobody gave me anything, I went to Harvard and got a master's degree. Then for 20 years, I was stuck being a lawyer. When I had a private practice, I told myself, I'm defending Aboriginal people from the justice system. And then I had this client who hired me. He'd hit his wife. and he hired me to defend him. And he lived in a far north community, so he paid my airfare and my hotel and my fee, and I flew up to his community and got rid of the charge for him. He hit her again, and again he hired me, and again I got rid of the charge. Third time he hit her, and it's starting to feel like he thinks he can hit her anytime he wants, and Harold Johnson's going to get him off. So I flew up to his community. We're holding court in the community hall. I took him out behind the community hall and I said, buddy, if you hit her again, I'm going to kick the shit out of you. Now you get in there and you plead guilty and I'll keep your sorry ass out of jail. And I knew I was on the wrong side. A position opened up in the Crown Prosecutor's office at the same time as 2008 hit. And I'm old enough to remember 1981 when the economy collapsed and all the work dried up. And I knew my little office wasn't going to survive. And along with my feelings and my thoughts at the time, I moved over to work for the Crown as a prosecutor. And as a prosecutor, I told myself, you're defending the victims. Well over 95% of the people charged in Northern Saskatchewan are Aboriginal, but 99% of the victims are Aboriginal, and they're usually women. So I just told myself the story that I'm defending the victim. And I told myself that story for so long that it kind of wore out. And I realized I'm just filling the jails full of Indians, and there's nothing I can do about it in this position. I left prosecutions. I had an opportunity to work on the Northern Alcohol Strategy because 95% of the people we saw in court were there for something they did while they were intoxicated by alcohol. We weren't dealing with criminality. We were dealing with alcohol use disorders. So we started the Northern Alcohol Strategy and changing the story. If we change the story we tell ourselves about alcohol, we can change reality. And after 4 years, we proved that it works. If you get everybody involved in a conversation, things change. And we had the whole community, the Larange, Arange, and Lac Larange Indian Band, the tri-community area, they all are all geographically located adjacent to each other. And sometimes you can travel from the reserve to the town simply by crossing the street. Got the three communities to work together, got the police and hospital and all the doctors and the Chamber of Commerce and the churches. And just got absolutely everybody that we could engage in the conversation. After 4 years, emergency room visits related to alcohol were down by 8%. RCMP calls for service related to alcohol were down. School attendance was up. Crime in the tri-community area went down. Then COVID hit. Province declared alcohol sales an essential service and gave people free money. And so any statistics that we were creating prior to that are all skewed by this anomaly of COVID. And I don't know what the numbers are now, but in 2019, we've proven the success of changing the story around alcohol. So that's what gets me to here. I'm retired from the Northern Alcohol Strategy. I'm still on a small contract with them. I'm more of an elder and an advisor now. I don't do any hands-on work because younger, more energetic people doing that. And it's growing to become a provincial strategy and not just a local strategy. I want to talk to you about stories, how powerful they are. When the community changed its story, it had quite dramatic results. Stories can heal you, and stories can kill you. Placebo. If I give you a sugar pill and tell you that it's medicine, 35 to 50% of you will experience a reduction in your symptoms. There was a young boy with leukemia He imagined a Lone Ranger riding through his blood veins, shooting the cancer cells with silver bullets. Cured himself of leukemia. There was a woman told she had cancer, didn't want to have cancer, didn't want to think about it. She went home and watched happy movies. Any movie as long as it had a happy ending. And she watched one after the other. 3 months later, she went back to her doctor. The cancer was gone. Stories can heal you. Stories can kill you. Nocebo is the opposite of placebo. I give you the same sugar pill. This time I tell you it's poison. If you take the pill and believe the story, you're going to get sick and you might even die. There's a young man, 26 years old, took 29 pills that he thought were antidepressants. His heart rate went down, his blood pressure went down, he required medical intervention. They had him on intravenous. He did not recover until they told him that all he had taken were sugar pills. Stories can kill you. So to tie this together, there's a fourth story. There's a man with a fast-acting cancer who heard about a new therapy. He asked his doctor to get it for him. He was given the new therapy and his cancer tumors within 2 weeks shrunk. And then he heard that the treatment was a fake, that it didn't work, and the cancer came back. His doctor, a little surprised at these results, told him, no, that second report that you read is false. This treatment actually does work. And he injected him just with sterile water. And the tumor shrunk away again. The man eventually died. They couldn't maintain the story. That's how powerful stories are. Stories can heal you. Stories can kill you. And everything is story. I am story. Your story. The universe's story. Consider Canada. We think of it as a nation. It isn't. It's just a story. You drive down to the border with the United States and look, there's no line there. We have a constitution. It's in writing. We wrote it. We could have written anything. It doesn't matter. It's okay. It works. But it's just a story. Most of the law is fiction. We just make shit up. Corporations don't exist. They're only real because law makes them so. The markets. Now, we used to believe in dragons and unicorns. Now we believe in market forces. And these market forces demand human sacrifice. There are people starving to death today. And here in North America, one of our biggest problems is obesity. We have too much to eat. And what we have to eat, we waste at least a quarter. I heard some estimates say we throw a third of our food away. We have way too much food here. But if we would take some of our food and give it to starving people, the economy would suffer. So some people have to die because of this story, this fiction that we've created about markets and economies. But everything is story. I am story, your story, the universe's story. And we write them every day. We write them as we live them. We write our life story. And to do that, the first advice when you're writing your life story is to write it in the first person. I, Harold Johnson, went out on my boat today. Then I'm in charge of the story. If you're writing in your life story in the third person, you're a victim. Somebody else is writing your story. Somebody else is making the decisions, not you. I'll get to some really hard questions about writing and writing your life story. It's about writing endings. My way of writing is usually to start at the beginning and write to the end. I get an idea, I've got a general direction where the story is going to go, and I just start writing. And sometimes I get really far into the story and I still don't know what the ending is. And I get tired of writing it. And I just pick an ending and stick it onto the story. And it's worked, but it's not really satisfactory. And I was talking with my friend Robert Sawyer. He's from your territory, Mississauga area. And we're talking about writing. And Robert says he never starts writing a book until he knows what the ending is. And that's really good advice. But how do we apply that to writing our life story? We're all going to die, but none of us know the details of it. So as you write your life story, you write for that last minute. Write for that last minute when you know the details of your death. But what's it going to be like for you? This is a scary place. Nobody likes to think about this minute. We do everything that we can to avoid thinking about this minute. What is your life like? What did it look like if you look back from that last minute? What do you want it to look like? That's a story that you have to be writing every day. When you fill pages and pages with life so beautiful, then in the last minute when you look back, all you see is beauty. Then you've written a masterpiece. You've done something really powerful. I've published 11 books now. My daughter's here visiting, and she was just in my office today, and she rearranged everything. So I kind of hope I can find stuff. This is the last one. The Bjorkan Sagas. And I started writing it. Well, no, I got to back up a bit before I started writing it. I wrote another book. Peace and Good Order. And I wrote it in a month and a half. When you write a book in a month and a half, you know there's a big edit coming. And that's where I was. I submitted it to the publisher. I know there's a big edit going to come. So I don't want to start writing anything new because I'll have to stop and do the big edit and then start again. And that's always a struggle to get started again. But every night when I went to sleep, I told myself a story. Just a little story in those moments between laying down and falling asleep. And I did it for so long that I had the whole story in my head. I knew it, but I didn't want to write it. Then one day, we were going to be traveling. I wasn't driving, my son was going to drive. And I had a couple hours with nothing to do, sitting in the back of a car. So as we were leaving the house, I grabbed a book off the bookshelf. I just saw on the spine, it said Hess. And I thought I'd grabbed Herman Hess. I got in the car and it wasn't Herman, it was Karen. And Karen Hess had written this book about 1930s Texas, Oklahoma Dust Bowl. And she'd written the whole thing as a poem. And I finished reading it and I said, well, I can do that. And I came home and I wrote Bjorka was the first title. It took me 2 weeks. And I sent it off to the publisher and they liked it. But they didn't know what to do with it. It was kind of short. So they said, well, maybe it could be a graphic novel. But I was experimenting with a new idea about writing that I'm calling minimalist. I don't tell the reader anything. I don't describe the color of my character's hair or his eyes or anything other, because I believe that the reader's imagination is more powerful than mine. So I lay out the outline of the story. And I'm writing it as a poem, but I'm not really a poet. I wrote a lot of poems when I was a teenager, but I do know that I typically write quite lyrically. There's a rhythm. So I decided I'm just going to write prose as lyrically as I can, and I'm going to arrange it on the page so it looks like a poem. People reading it, their brain will say, well, that looks like a poem, so they'll read it like a poem. And I thought that's pretty clever. Got into negotiating with the publisher, and we figured out that a graphic novel wasn't going to work because of this minimalist style where I give clues to the reader and allow them to make discoveries on their own. And that doesn't work in a graphic novel because the picture that accompanies the script will give away the surprise that I want the reader to discover on their own. So in meeting with the publisher, they said, Harold, what we really want is more. So I went home and wrote the second and third saga. And then we're communicating back and forth for a while, and then communication kind of dried up. Nobody was answering phones, nobody was answering emails. So I finally got a hold of one of the editors there and said, hey, you guys, it's okay. I'm going to love you anyways. Doesn't matter. If you don't publish it, I'm still going to love you. It's all right. And I was told, yeah, Harold, we just don't know what to do with it. You got this 3 sagas all written as poems, and nobody's ever done anything like this before. We're just stumped. We don't know what to do with this. It's just as COVID was kicking in, and we tried moving it to some of the fantasy houses, but New York was shut down. And this is the beginning of COVID. New York got hit hard. There's just no getting through. So I asked my agent if I could get the manuscript back. And she agreed. And my plan was to self-publish. But I know if you're going to publish anything, you need a good editor. Because as the author, you cannot see your own mistakes. It's part of the story. If I wrote something on my computer, and that's what was in my head, but I actually wrote something else, when I go back to read it, I will read what I thought I wrote. My eyes will show me the letters that I thought I put on the page and not the letters that are actually on the page. Our eyes actually are terrific liars. A lot of what you see is socially derived. So you each have 2 eyes. You should see 2 pictures, 1 for each eye. Each picture should be clear towards the center and fuzzy around the outside because you have more cones and rods closer to the center of your eye than you have in the periphery. Each of those pictures should have a black hole in the center because you cannot see through the optic nerve that runs down the center of your retina. What your brain does is takes those two pictures together, merges them, and fills in the empty spot. And it fills the empty spot in with things you made up. A lot of what you see is socially derived. Just going to give you another example of how powerful this storytelling is. When I'm on the road, I know that the best coffee out there is McDonald's. So I'm standing in a McDonald's. I've ordered 4 shots of espresso. It's a strange order and it takes them a bit of time to fill. And while I'm standing there, an Aboriginal woman walks in and she saw me from across the floor and started walking towards me. And I saw her coming and I said, ah, shit, here it comes. She's going to tell me about a sick relative on the reserve and want to borrow $20. But as she got closer, I said, no matter what, you treat this woman with respect. And she came up to me and she just wanted to visit. Maybe she saw the braids. And I checked her out. Her shoes were shiny. She had a crease up the front of her pants. Her blouse was new. Her hair was so clean it shone. I checked her breath. There was no alcohol on it, nothing to cover it up. You know that lazy, dirty, drunken Indian story? That's a powerful story. That story is so powerful, it showed me a drunk where there wasn't one. My eyes saw a dirty drunk because of a very powerful story about lazy, dirty, drunken Indians. So anybody who says they're not racist, who doesn't check their story every time, it's full of shit. Because I have to. And I had a brown-skinned mother who loved me. Let's go back to Bjorkan Sagas. I knew I needed an editor, and the best editor I know is Sean Virgo. He worked with me on all my early fiction, and we worked really well together. He puts a lot of creative energy into his edits. He suggests changes. I never followed his suggestions to the letter. Quite often I'd write a passage. Sean would come and say, this passage sucks. Try writing it this way. And I'd write it in a third way so that it didn't suck, but it was my words. And through working with Sean, I learned a lot about writing. So I called Sean up. I said, Sean, I'll pay you whatever it is the publishing houses pay for you to edit, but I need a good editor for this. And he said, I'm way too busy. You know, I got way too much on my plate. I want to write my own novel, and I'm putting all my energy into other people's work. Hate to disappoint you, Harold, but I just can't. But send it to me anyway. So I sent it to Sean. He gets back to me and says, I understand why the publishing houses struggle with this. He said, you might want to commit a literary fraud and say you found it. Write a frame story. So, say one of your Swedish relatives left it for you. Or write an introduction and an ending to frame the sagas with. So I did. And I wrote it from the place where I was living at the time, that trapper's cabin in northern Saskatchewan. And I really liked it. I liked the frame. I wasn't writing minimalistically. I was just exploring and just enjoying writing, enjoying the creativity and tying loose ends together as I wrote it. And then Sean gets back to me and says, Harold, you're not really a poet, you know that. And I said, yeah, I know, Sean. He said, do you know that the Icelandic and Irish sagas are not poems? They're primarily prose with poetic lines interspersed. You might want to try that. So I did, just to check it out. And I really liked the result. When I took those poems and put them back as prose, I discovered this style of writing that's very poetic, that's lyrical and just flows. Yeah, a beautiful flow to it. And then the interspersed poetic lines just add a new dimension to it. And we're just stepping outside of genre. Never mind genre, never mind those rules. Let's just make up our new stuff and let's explore this form of art. Let's find this out. So that's the end result. That's how the Bjorkan Sagas came to be the Bjorkan Sagas instead of simply Bjorka. And in doing this Scandinavian Swedish work, I'm touching back to my father. My father was born in Sweden. He immigrated to Canada in 1907. I've written 11 books. 10 of them are from an Aboriginal perspective, from my mother. Because that's where I grew up. I grew up in an Aboriginal community. That's what I know. But I'm half Swede. And to be honest, I have to recognize that side as well. So the Bjorkan Sagas are my way of becoming a complete writer, becoming a complete person. I am Aboriginal, but I'm also Swede. And I have these two traditions that aren't contradictory. When I went to Sweden and saw where my father came from, northern Sweden looks a lot like northern Saskatchewan. It's all forest and rocks, and got blueberries and cranberries, and there's grouse and there's foxes and there's wolverines and there's moose. It all pretty much the same. So imagine when my father got to northern Saskatchewan, when he met my mother, that he must have felt like he was coming home. And he came from a tradition in Sweden of hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, and farming. Lived in north central Sweden, and that's just the way that his family lived. So coming to northern Saskatchewan, he's again hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, and growing really big gardens to raise a family of 9. So this is where I got myself to. This recognition of myself as a complete person and making sure my story was complete. And I'm telling my life story. And how are we doing for time? I think we're pretty close, eh?
We're doing good. If you want, we can invite people to start submitting some questions.
I think that would be good.
Yeah, so if anyone has a question, feel free now to pop it in the chat box and we'll open the floor. To get us started, as you're still kind of talking about the influence of family on your writing, I'm not all the way through it, but I've started reading Clifford. And so I'm kind of curious if you could talk about how that fits in, because I know as I'm reading it, I'm trying to figure out the line between, how much is reality, how much is kind of how you're kind of pulling in perspective. But you do talk a lot about storytelling and the influence of family in that book. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit to that for everyone else in the audience.
Clifford has a scene where my older brother puts me in a soap bubble and sends me to the moon using thought energy. That's obviously fantasy. Clifford won the nonfiction book award in Saskatchewan. I had to really thank the judges. I mean, that took a lot of courage to select that one as the nonfiction book of the year. but I couldn't tell it any other way. My older brother was in this world when I got here, and he'd been waiting for me. And he went to school, and he was 6 years older than me. He went to school and he came home and he taught me the things that they taught him in school. He taught me how to read and write. Between him and my father, I learned how to count so that I could play cribbage. And Clifford took me under his wing, took good care of me. He wanted to be a scientist. But he growing up in northern Saskatchewan, that's a big dream. Most people couldn't even imagine finishing high school. Because in our community, school went to grade 8. And all of my brothers older than Clifford, when they finished grade 8, simply went mining or logging. 14 years old, go work in the logging camps. And Clifford wanted to be a scientist. He read lots of science fiction. It was his favorite book to read was anything by Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury. So to tell the story of Clifford, because I'm looking at him as the younger sibling, 6 years younger, and he's more than real from my eyes. So to tell his story, I had to write it as fiction. And I think he'd get a kick out of it that I wrote him as science fiction. We used to have really good conversations. We could talk about ideas. And we spent lots of time drinking coffee, talking about ideas. He got killed by a drunk driver in 1985. And I didn't have anybody to talk to anymore. But I was still having ideas. And I tried writing them out. I tried writing out these scientific ideas, these thoughts about space, time, energy. And it just never worked. Could never get it right, trying to explain it. So when I was writing Clifford, I gave all of the ideas to my older brother and had him tell them to me. And as soon as I did that, it worked. The ideas came together with when I put them into his head and he told them to me in the story. That was it. That's Clifford.
And it is, yes, a very intriguing story for those of you who might be interested, because it is, I'm looking at it right here, categorized as a biography, but as I was saying, yeah, it seems to kind of toe the line as well between reality and fantasy. So it's a different one for everyone to check out if they're interested.
The title is Clifford, a memoir, a fiction, a fantasy, a thought experiment. So this is my first attempt at blurring the lines between genre. I don't think we really need them. All genre is there for so that bookstores know what shelf to put a book on. Or the publisher knows which catalog to advertise it in. There's no real difference between fiction and nonfiction. When I write the Bjorkan Sagas, which is pure fiction fantasy, I'm writing what I know. I'm changing stories around that I already know. The culture that I give the Bjorken people is an Aboriginal culture from northern Saskatchewan before contact. Oh, is that fiction or nonfiction? I'm telling a cultural story. I just changed who is experiencing that culture. When I write nonfiction, I'm writing from my own perspective. And I don't know if it's real. like I said, my eyes lie to me. Our ears do the same thing. We're used to hearing certain sounds, and our brain deciphers the waves in the air, and we hear sounds. But your brain will fill in the sounds that you miss, so that you hear stuff. So a lot of stuff that I think I know might not be real. And even though I'm doing my best to, when I'm writing nonfiction, like Peace and Good Order and Firewater, it's quite likely that a lot of what I wrote, because it's simply from my perspective, is not real for anybody else who was there at the same time. Therefore, a lot of nonfiction is actually fiction, because as writers, we have no choice.
Yeah, we have a couple comments coming in here. So I will just pass along Rosemary's comment that she finds you wonderful to listen to and wants to thank you for everything that you do. And Diane has a question. She says, you seem to approach writing as an individual. So what do you draw from other writers? Do you have any influences, I guess?
I'm very careful not to. For me, the hardest part about writing is that I can't read at the same time. I'm so afraid that I will borrow from somebody else. When I get into a book, I get right into it. I immerse myself into the book that I'm reading in the same way that I immerse myself into my writing. So I'm very careful to not read, and especially not read anything that's close to what I'm working on at the time. I've got writers that I like. Robert Sawyer. I really like the science in his science fiction because it's accurate science. Earliest influence would be John Steinbeck. And I love his storytelling, his wordcraft. And you didn't see the wordcraft because the storytelling was so powerful. I like William Faulkner, which is all wordcraft. But in that dense writing style of his, that craft that's so close to the surface, underneath it, there's always a powerful story. So both of them able to put wordcraft and storytelling together and finding different balances. So those are my early influences. My biggest influence, I think, would be Leo Tolstoy. Not so much for his writing style, because I don't know what that is. It was translated from Russian. But what he said, and I'm not talking about War and Peace or Anna Karenina, I'm talking about his later works, Confessions. And when he started thinking about, what the hell am I doing here? Maybe I should just kill myself because life doesn't have any purpose. And then he goes out and finds out what purpose there is. That courage. Well, here's a man who's seriously contemplating ending it all. But he thinks maybe there is a reason to live. And he went looking for that reason. And that honesty in his writing, in his later writings. Gandhi got his ideas of pacifism from Tolstoy. They were writing back and forth to each other before Gandhi went back to India. And then Martin Luther King borrows from Gandhi. And we're all borrowing in our activism from Leo Tolstoy. So those are my influences. For 20 years as a lawyer, I read very, very little for pleasure. because I spent all day reading really badly written police reports. And the last thing I wanted to do when I got home was to read anymore. I wanted to get outside and do something. I wanted to get my dog team and go for a run, or go set a fish net, or go cut a load of firewood, do something physical and outside. And it was really good when I got to the end of the practice of law. I remember I'm going to start reading again, and I walked into McNally Robinson in Saskatoon and walked up to one of the people who worked there, and I said, I want to read a book that has magic in it. What do you recommend? And she handed me 15 Dogs. Yeah, that's the kind of magic that brought me back to writing. And I think that's why I switched over to away from writing those really hard books like Firewater and Peace and Good Order, to just giving myself a break and writing the Bjorkan Sagas.
And I'd be curious, you've just kind of mentioned that you tend to get very immersed, whether you're reading or writing. And you've also mentioned that with the Bjorkan Sagas, you kind of had the whole story in your head as well. So I'm curious about your writing process when you talk about writing these books in such a short frame of time. Do you tend to kind of think of everything first and then kind of sit down, or do you have books that you have kind of worked on over a longer process? I'm just kind of curious if every book's kind of look the same, or if you do something different each time.
I want to write every book to be completely different than anything else I've ever done. Louis Lemire wrote over 200 books, all the same story. Yeah. Someday somebody's going to recognize him as the fantastic writer that he was, but he kind of ruined it by repeating it over and over again. He doesn't get the recognition for the literary expert that he was. So I was going to write something new. I want to write different style, different voice. But I learned something from Leo Tolstoy. When I wrote Firewater, How Alcohol is Killing My People and Yours, it's a hard subject to broach. How do you talk about Indians and alcohol when there's this dominant story out there about the lazy, dirty, drunken Indian? And take that story on. The only way I could find to do it was by being brutally honest with myself as I sat down to write it. And as I'm writing it, there were many times when I stood up from the computer and walked away, said, "You can't write that." And the little voice would say, "But it's true." And I'd force my ass back into the chair and continue writing through things that were really, really hard, difficult things for me emotionally, physically, spiritually, to get onto the page. And I think it worked. I think that style of writing where you write through your own pain can be powerful. Peace and Good Order was much the same. I got to write about a justice system that I took part in. I got to talk about filling the jails full of Aboriginal people, being part of the problem instead of the solution that I thought I was, and to be honest about it, and to admit I screwed up. I think that's what makes those books, gives those books the strength, is writing through my own pain. But they were written differently than a book like the Bjorkan Sagas. When I'm writing fiction, I'm making up the story, I'm creating it. When I'm writing nonfiction, I'm just dumping. I got all of these things in my head. I know all of this stuff already, and I don't have to make that up. I just got these ideas and I'm going to dump them on the page and arrange them so that they look kind of okay. And then go through and put structure to it. But it's just this dumping. I'm not creating. I'm using wordcraft. But that's it. That's the only artistic part of it, is the wordcraft that goes into it. The story itself was already there. And I got it and I brought it and I put it on the page. Writing fiction is different. Writing fiction, you create worlds. You create people. And they're all coming out of your head. And they all have to fit together. So my strategy in writing fiction is, as I'm laying down at night to go to sleep, I imagine the story, where I am in the story. And then I put those thoughts into the dream world. And I get up in the morning, and I like writing really early while I'm still close to that dream world. And so these thoughts of mine that I put into the dream world when I went to sleep come back to me in the morning, filtered through that dream world. And that's where the story flows out from there. But it's gone through a filter.
And Rosemary's just shared a comment here. She said, we all screw up, but sharing as you have draws us together as humans.
Mm-hmm.
So you've talked about how with the Bjorkan Sagas, you were kind of tapping into the Scandinavian side of your heritage. So do you plan to kind of revisit that? I know you just said you kind of do everything a little bit different every time. So I'm just curious, is that still kind of in the works? Or do you kind of consider that done with the Bjorkan Sagas, and are you moving on to something else? If you have a little bit of a teaser or something for us.
I got the notes for a substantive edit for my biography. So the working title is From the Trapline to Harvard and Back Again. But it's mostly about my mother and father. And so it's mostly their story. And I haven't read the notes of the substantive edit, but it'll be coming out by McClelland and Stewart, and I don't have a pub date for it. So that's the next work that I'm going to be working on, is again in substantive edits. And it's going to be lots of work sitting here and figuring out what I need to say that fits with what the publishing house wants me to say. I have a manuscript called The Power of Story that is now with a publisher that I'm really, really hoping will pick it up, because I really like the editors that work there. But that's a finished manuscript. And I've heard through the grapevine that I can expect an offer soon, and that they expect that there's some work that needs to be done on it. And I'm okay with that. And then there's the manuscript that's on my computer that is not going to be a novella, because I just crossed that 30,000 word barrier, and it's going to be a novel. And again, I'm back writing fiction, fantasy. I'm back in northern Saskatchewan, and I'm writing about the little people. And right now, the title of the book is Climate Refugees.
And Rosemary's just shared here that she loves the title, The Power of Story. And as I was saying at the beginning, you've also had quite a remarkable life story. So definitely looking forward to seeing that come out to you as a biography about your life and your family's life.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
All right, we'll do a last call for questions. I don't know if anyone has anything they want to wrap up with. Otherwise, thank you very much, Harold, for joining us tonight. It's been great kind of to hear both kind of your concept of story and storytelling and how that has kind of influenced each of your works and the different process that you have gone through for each of them. So thank you very much for sharing that with us tonight.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. So yeah, on behalf of the library and everyone here tonight, I just want to formally thank you very much for coming. And I see some comments coming in as well, echoing the sentiment. For everyone on the call, if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, I just want to let you know that we have another programming coming up next week that may be of interest. So Betty Ann Adams is actually joining us, and she worked on the documentary Birth of a Family, which actually chronicles the story of her own family. She was one of 4 siblings that were all separated during the 60s scoop, and they met for the first time as adults. So she'll be joining us to talk about that documentary and the process of going through that story and what that was like as an experience. So definitely check it out. You can register now and we'll give you access to the screening for the film. So yes, thank you very much, Harold, and thank you very much to the audience and everyone who joined us tonight. Yeah, lots of great things coming in. Fantastic chat. Thank you for sharing your time. We do appreciate it. And thank you very much, Harold. And thank you very much to the audience. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evenings.
Okay. Have a good night.
Thank you.